Colby Covington is one of the most outspoken fighters in UFC history. Without going over his entire backstory, which has been covered in a lot of detail, the story goes that Colby was almost cut by the UFC due to his heavy wrestling style not being particularly fan-friendly. Rather than adapting his fighting style that had seen him racking up the wins, he decided to become the bad guy of the UFC, going after his opponents, fighters from other divisions, and even Dana White. And in fairness to Colby, despite rubbing people up the wrong way, from a career perspective, this did seem to work out. There were the obvious financial benefits from the increased attention he was getting. It seemed like he was getting more favourable matchups from the UFC, and these were both largely down to the persona that he'd created. The problem is that Colby's whole brand only works if he's winning, and with more losses than wins on his record in recent years, he's at a real crossroads in his career. Now he's fighting rising welterweight Joaquin Buckley, who's coming off a career best win against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Colby's future hangs in the balance of this fight. If he wins, he puts himself back up there for title contention. If he loses, his ranking and brand will take a huge hit, from which I'm not sure he can recover. Which is why I'm calling this the Joaquin Buckley gamble. In this video, we're going to look at Joaquin Buckley as an opponent to Colby, how Colby's looking going into this fight, and I'll end the video with my final prediction. So first, let's look at how Colby's looking heading into this fight. I think that's a good place to start. Now, I'm seeing a lot of things online saying that Colby's finished, he's washed, down to his last performance against Leon Edwards. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a really lacklustre performance, it was poor, Colby looked tentative, he never really got going in the fight, and after that build-up, talking that huge game, he really let all the fans down. However, one thing that I just don't agree with in the fight world, it happens in boxing, it happens in mixed martial arts, is writing off a fighter after one poor performance. You can forgive his losses to Kamaru Usman. They were title shots, they were really competitive. I get it that this performance is different, but one bad performance doesn't make you washed, it doesn't make you finished. It can definitely signal that you might be on your decline, you might be past your prime, something like that. But I think you have to take into consideration that fighters can have off nights, and this was definitely an off night for Colby Covington. At the same time, even if we can't call Colby washed or finished from this performance, there are still obviously a lot of things that we can take from it when considering how he'll match up against Joaquin Buckley. But before we look at Colby's downside, let's take a look at his last 3 wins, see what positives we can take from those performances heading into this one, see if he's still got it at this level. Now, looking back at his last 3 wins doesn't make the best reading. He's beaten Jorge Masvidal, Tyron Woodley and Robbie Lawler. If you're going to ask anyone about these names, in their day, great fighters, at least Tyron Woodley and Robbie Lawler worked. Jorge Masvidal was very good. He had that purple patch in his career in 2019. But when he fought all these fighters, they were past their prime. I'm not going to spend too much time reading into the Tyron Woodley fight because I just don't think there's that much we can take from it. Tyron Woodley was truly past his best at this point, and Colby made fairly light work of him. However, the Jorge Masvidal and Robbie Lawler fights I do want to give a bit of attention to because they just demonstrated what Colby does best. And I believe, MMA purists will believe, it is actually quite a fan-friendly style. Yes, you're not going to get knockouts, you're probably not going to get submissions, but when Colby's got that engine running, when he's up in your face, pressuring you against the fence, doing his chain wrestling, mixing up some really nice takedowns, at least for me, that version of Colby Covington is really good to watch, and I hope he brings that version of himself to the fight against Joaquin Buckley. We get to see his cardio on full display, that third lung that is often spoken about. Colby just doesn't get tired, he's in your face, pressuring you backwards, and let's face it, he'll need that against an explosive fighter like Joaquin Buckley. On the other hand, there is the very real possibility that Colby just isn't there anymore. The Colby Covington we saw against Leon Edwards did raise a lot of red flags. He was extremely timid, he looked really concerned about what was coming back his way, which is understandable given how Leon Edwards had just knocked out the former welterweight champion Kamaru Usman. However, Belal Muhammad went on to show what it is you need to do against Leon Edwards. Put pressure on him, get his back on the fence, typically what Colby Covington does best. But he just wouldn't engage with Leon Edwards in that fight, and ultimately it left a bad taste in the mouth of the fans. So this time round, Colby needs to make sure that he doesn't repeat that performance. If he does, Joaquin Buckley is just going to jump all over him. Joaquin Buckley has more power than Leon Edwards, and he won't be as forgiving. If Colby backs off, if Colby stands at range, Joaquin Buckley will try and knock him out. And there is one more thing to consider, and that is an incident that happened outside of the the ring. It was the sucker punch by Jorge Masvidal on Colby Covington that apparently left a concussion. You could see the damage to Colby's teeth. Was it this incident that made him more timid? Does he not trust his chin anymore? Does he lack that self-belief? These are all very real factors. I don't think I'm digging too deeply into this. But all these things need to be taken into consideration when thinking about how he matches up with Joaquin Buckley. Colby needs to be aggressive, he needs to put pressure forward, and he needs to believe in his own ability and his own gas tank if he wants to win this fight. And that takes us nicely on to what's at stake for Colby Covington. Now, Colby gained a reputation for sitting around and waiting for title shots, and this was evidenced in his lack of activity over the last few years. That's why taking this fight surprised so many people, especially when you consider the risk versus reward when compared to taking a title shot. I think it comes down to the fact that Colby's options may have been fairly limited heading into this one. After having 3 losses in title shots and that performance against Leon Edwards, there's no question that his stock has gone down. It seems as though fans who were previously entertaining the Colby brand, the Colby persona, were getting a bit fed up. As we said at the start of the video, this persona, this brand only works when you're winning fights. The way Colby was acting did get eyeballs on his fights, people hoping that he was just going to get knocked out. But because of his sheer toughness, you had to respect him. That kind of went out the window with the Leon Edwards performance, which is why this fight is so important for him, why it is such a gamble. So when we're considering what's at stake, we need to look at the 2 possible outcomes, Colby winning or Colby losing. I'm not going to take into account him drawing, but let's face it, that's probably going to happen now. So if Colby wins, what does that mean for his career? Well, Joaquin Buckley has really come on over the last 12 months. From being a run-of-the-mill welterweight, had fought at middleweight before with a couple of losses on his record. People have started to take notice because of the win streak he's on, particularly with his last win against Wonderboy. That was the best name on his record. And it's one thing grappling with Wonderboy and grinding out a decision win, but to knock out Wonderboy, that's something else. That's a true statement in this division. So even though Buckley's still far from a household name, his recent win streak and that last win have put him on a lot of people's radars. And I think that Colby's taking this fight because he knows that winning it will put him right back into the title picture. And that's the only place that he ever wants to be. Of course, there is more risk in taking this fight than taking a title shot, but that's just not an option to Colby right now. There are too many losses on his recent record, and this is probably the best fight that he could have got. Ian Gary is facing Shavkat Rakhmonov. You'd like to think that probably is a true #1 contender fight, but you know how the UFC works, injuries happen, pullouts happen. In reality, this could actually be a #1 contender fight, and that is going to frustrate a lot of Colby haters. So whilst we're talking about that, let's consider what happens if Colby loses. And because we're talking about title fights, losing this one wouldn't be the same as losing a title fight. Losing a tough decision to Kamaru Usman or a late stoppage to Kamaru Usman doesn't really lower your stock, especially because the fight beforehand was so competitive. However, losing to a guy lower on the rankings, someone who's been nowhere near a title shot before, would really damage his stock. A loss here would set Colby back years, possibly even to retirement. Colby's got no interest in being a gatekeeper in this division. In fact, it kind of comes on to the next thing I want to talk about, which is what's next for Colby. And I truly believe that a path into the WWE pro wrestling is a logical step for him to take. Obviously an elite college wrestler, I know it's a different world, but he's got the athleticism and the skills on the mic to make that transition happen. But really, to increase his negotiating powers, it would make sense for him to make a statement last performance, or at least rack up a couple of good wins before retiring. And I know this isn't strictly talk about the fight itself, but if Colby does want to pursue that kind of career, maybe it is worth making a statement, showing that you're not completely finished, not ending on a lackluster performance like he did against Leon Edwards. There is so much at stake in this gamble, the Joaquin Buckley gamble. If he wins, he's right back up there. If he loses, his time in the sport could actually be done. It's very rare that you get fights of this much significance from people who aren't even former title holders, but that is really how much is at stake in this fight. And of course, it takes 2 to tango. You've got to have a dance partner, and Joaquin Buckley is a very, very dangerous opponent to be taking on. That's why this is such a gamble. Colby's gone all in, but there's a few reasons why I think that he's handpicked Joaquin Buckley as an opponent. There's a couple of openings there, but let's first look at what Joaquin Buckley does well and why he could be so dangerous for Colby. I want to make it absolutely clear at this point that if Colby does go in with the same approach as he did against Leon Edwards, he's going to get knocked out in this fight. Simple as that. If you're timid, if you're not throwing, Joaquin Buckley will knock him out. Let's be absolutely clear about that. He'll blitz forward, landing some absolute bombs and just get Colby out of there. Buckley's an extremely dynamic striker. We saw in that spinning kick, the highlight that everyone's probably seen 100 times already. Buckley can do that kind of thing. He's super dangerous, dynamic, explosive. If Colby's timid, if Colby's moving backwards, if Colby's allowing Joaquin Buckley to get shots off at range, he's going to get knocked out. That isn't my final prediction, but that is my prediction if Colby takes that approach. Due to Buckley's physique, let's face it, he's absolutely jacked. There are obviously going to be question marks over his gas tank, but I've not really seen that to be an issue so far. I think there were one or two fights where he was definitely tiring at the end, but all fighters get tired. That doesn't necessarily mean they've got a bad gas tank. So I'm not going to say necessarily that he does have a bad gas tank, but really if Colby's on it, it's not going to be as good as Colby's. So if Colby can get to Buckley, if he can take him down, make him hold his weight, get him tired over the first 2 rounds, then Colby could really run away with this fight. But I'm not prepared to say that Buckley's gas tank is questionable, not yet anyway. Taking a look at Buckley's record, his best 2 wins are against Vicente Luque and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Now these are 2 great names to have on your record, but both fighters were past their prime when he faced them. So other than that, Colby will by far be the best name on his record. So in reality, Buckley is largely unproven. Yes, he's been on a great streak, he's looked really good. Colby would definitely represent a step up in competition. And maybe that's why Colby accepted the fight, because he believes that he's just on another level to Joaquin Buckley. And I can't really say that he's not, because we've not seen that from Buckley yet. Finally, when talking about Joaquin Buckley against Colby Covington, we need to talk about wrestling. We know that Colby's going to be going for the takedowns. Hopefully, for his sake, he's going to be putting the pressure forward, really getting at Buckley. So what's Buckley's takedown defense like? Now, I've picked out a few screenshots from his fight with Imavov, because that's a recent loss where wrestling was used. Now, there were a few occasions where Imavov was able to get him down very easily. I'm sure that this is something that Team Covington have identified as a potential path to victory. Not only was Imavov able to get Buckley down, not at will, because Buckley did defend a few times, but Imavov was able to take him down and get him tired. That's key. So whilst Buckley does have a good gas tank, when he's forced to wrestle, that's when he gets tired. So I truly believe that Covington's team have taken a look at this fight, seen their openings there, and thought that this fight would be a good matchup, a good step to take Colby closer to the title once again. So overall, when we're looking at how risky Joaquin Buckley is as an opponent to Colby Covington, I think the answer is he's very risky, but there are a few openings. I've not just dismissed him as a muscular, explosive fighter, which he is, but he's also very dynamic on the feet. So as well as blitzing forward, he'll be creative with the angles that he comes at against Covington. He does wing his punches slightly, so there will be openings there for Colby to take him down. But in reality, Colby's facing a very dangerous fighter. Someone who's 30 years old, just entering the prime of their life. I can guarantee you Joaquin Buckley is looking at Colby as a meal ticket to a UFC title shot. It's as simple as that. Buckley's probably licking his lips at the opportunity of facing a slightly faded version of Colby Covington. Someone who still has great name value, but isn't the fighter they were a few years ago. And I've been putting it off as long as possible, but I'm going to have to make my prediction for this fight. It's a really tough fight to call. Experience would tell me to go with the younger fighter, the fresher fighter, the fighter who appears to be heading nearer their prime. But at the same time, I do believe there's at least one more good performance left in Colby Covington. I'm not taking too much away from the Leon Edwards performance. I'm putting that down to more of a bad night rather than an overall reflection of where Colby is in his career right now. Joaquin Buckley, Vicente Luque, Wonderboy Thompson, they're dangerous fighters even at their ages, but they don't offer the same threats as Colby Covington. We saw what happened with Joaquin Buckley in the Imavov fight. He was taken down. That was ultimately what got Imavov the win. So where am I going to land when it comes to this? You can tell that I'm still debating it, deciding it. Can I make 2 predictions? No, I'll go for 1. I think I'm going to go for Colby Covington. I know, right, let me do a slight disclaimer. I'm going to go for Buckley if Colby comes out. I'll know within the first 10 seconds, 20 seconds of this fight if Colby's going to get knocked out or not. That's what I am saying. If he comes out timid, tentative, doesn't go straight at Buckley, then lump on Buckley. He's going to win by knockout. However, if Colby comes out confident, smiling, aggressive in Buckley's face, I think the wrestling will be too much for him. I think he'll be able to grind out. He could even 50-45 him. That's how crazy this game is. So on balance, I think I'm going to go for Colby Covington winning by decision. I think there will be a few sketchy moments in there. We've seen Covington get hit many times, dropped by Masvidal, knocked out by Kamaru Usman. Covington is there to be hit. His striking's far from elite. I think there will be a few moments in there where Buckley gets to him. but I think overall Covington will be able to take him down early. He will make him tired. He will steadily diminish the power that's coming back at him. I think he'll win a decision. Let me know what you guys think. I've called this the Joaquin Buckley gamble because it's a huge risk for Colby Covington, but ultimately I think it's one that does pay off.